Hello and welcome to the lecture 4 of the lecture series Psychology of Wellbeing. And today's lecture is on theories of well-being from the positivist paradigm. Well, we have seen in the previous lectures that the understanding of well-being entails certain kinds of assumptions about what well-being is, and those assumptions take us towards various kinds of paradigms in social science that help us understand the nature of well-being in a more systematic manner. For example, we had seen that how the hedonic or eudaimonic assumptions about well-being tell us something about well-being as an experience or a being as a perception that lies within the person, within the individual. So the intrapsychic assumptions that are further studied as variables being out there, and how those variables about experiences or perceptions of well-being could be related to other important aspects of our life. For example, like economic realities or financial status of the person. So such a study of relationship amongst various variables about the phenomenon of well-being or the other processes that might be related to the phenomenon of well-being help us understand, with the help of the positivist paradigm, various important elements of our understanding about well-being. So with that promise, let us move on to the outline of this particular lecture. Now, this comprises a variety of assumptions regarding the natural science or the positivist paradigm. And then it moves on to the nature, contribution, and limitations of these theories pertaining to the positivist paradigm. And these theories would range from subjective well-being by Edward Diner to psychological well-being, Carol Riff's work, then social well-being by Case, then self-determination theory by Ryan and Dacey, and then PERMA model by Seligman quite recently. And then finally, not to forget the objective conditions of well-being that is talked about in the concept of objective well-being, initially propounded by or put forward by Fels and Perry in 1995. So let's take up the various important assumptions of the natural science or the positivist paradigm. And that tells us that what is the nature of reality in terms of ontology. So it says that reality exists out there to be discovered towards universal generalizations. So well-being as having good life, how is it related to several other kinds of processes or factors? And can we generalize some universal generalizations? Can we have some universal generalizations regarding such relationships? Then what is the nature of relationship between the knower and the knowable? So this is distant or hierarchical relationship. Then methodology, how do we study that phenomenon that's taken to be existing out there? Well, with the help of experimentation or survey, and that is facilitated by neutral observations or data collection procedures using variables about the phenomenon under study. Well, then finally, we take up the question of, or this paradigm takes up the question of axiology, or what purpose does the knowledge derived from this particular paradigm serve to the participants or to the human participants who have participated in the study or in developing these kinds of theories. So that purpose is generally decided by the researcher on the basis of existing literature and proposed research. Well, we begin with the first in the series of these theories, initially put forward and popularized by Edward Diner in 1984, I beg your pardon. And it talks about subjective evaluation of one's own life in terms of having positive emotions like joy, happiness, love, and low levels of negative emotions like stress, anger, etc. And then also having a good sense of satisfaction in life overall in terms of fulfillment, meaning, or success, and also satisfaction in various domains of our life. For example, health, whether or not I'm healthy, whether or not I'm working well, satisfaction related to that, and also marriage or relationships, etc. Well, the subjective evaluation can be influenced by both internal and external factors, but as Ed Diner points out, that these subjective evaluations again are subjective. So how these are going to be, these internal or external factors that we are going to talk about right now, how these are evaluated by people themselves would vary from person to person. That's why subjective evaluations or subjective well-being. But in general, one may have certain kinds of generalizations. For example, internal factors such as physical health, personality traits like resilience or altruism would be related to a better sense of well-being, and external factors like good work life, access to material resources, relationships usually may be thought of as being associated with a positive sense of positive evaluations about one life. Well, the theory tells us importantly about the experiences of having a good life or good existence in terms of these perceptions or evaluations, but the limitations besides that contribution is this, that if conditions are adverse for people in the world, subjective well-being doesn't say much about how to build a more just society, as it emphasizes merely on or largely on good society leading to subjective well-being. Let's also not forget that this particular theory is based on the hedonic view of well-being that emphasizes on pleasure and happiness. From here, we move on to another important theory that came way back in 1980s that's known as psychological well-being. And importantly, the eudaimonic view of well-being, initially talked about by Aristotle, that is all about being true to one's inner self or daemon, is in order to live a meaningful life. So psychological well-being is based on that. Let us see how. Well, psychological well-being is characterized by a sense of meaning in life, particularly the concerns about who am I? Then do we also have the pursuit of our own ethical values in life? So that's another characteristic feature of it. And then whether or not I have the environmental mastery or making suitable changes in the environment to suit my self-growth. So all these important characteristics of one's experience in life tells us about the very phenomenon, or that's conceptualized as the phenomenon called psychological well-being as a part of person's experience. Well, besides that contribution in terms of helping us understand that what kind of experiences may be taken to be that of well-being or having good life or existence, psychological well-being also has limitations in terms of this, that if conditions are adverse, it points out, or it puts much onus on the person to change the environment. So rather than, again, having certain kinds of structural changes, the onus is on the person to change the environment. That may be too much, at least for some people who may be facing challenging times in their lives. Well, that is psychological well-being for us. We move on to another important theory called social well-being theory. So what was the need for this particular theory to be put forward by Keyes in 1998? Well, it is based on the critique of subjective well-being and psychological well-being, because these do not provide much insights about individual society relationship that shapes one's well-being. Let's see how this theory bridges this particular gap. Well, according to Keyes, well-being is the appraisal of one's circumstances and functioning in the society. Well, these are very important elements of it. The appraisal of one's circumstances and functioning in the society. Well, it involves social integration, which means that whether or not I have a feeling of belonging to the community or society, whether I belong to my community or society. Well, the second one, social contribution, whether or not I'm able to contribute to the world or to my society, that social contribution. If I have that sense, then I have a better sense of well-being or social well-being. Then social coherence, whether or not I'm able to understand social happenings. If I'm able to understand what's happening all around me, that is something that gives me a better sense of well-being. Then social actualization, which means that being hopeful about present and future of societal conditions for human growth. If I'm hopeful about that, I have a better sense of well-being. Then social acceptance, that's very important. It tells us about whether or not I have the trusting others in my society who are kind and caring towards me. So social acceptance in these terms. Now, the contributions of this theory, we have already seen that it helps us understand with the help of its focus on individual society relationship, that well-being could be the appraisal of one's circumstances and functioning in the society. The better that appraisal, the better sense of well-being. However, it also has the limitation that it overemphasizes on individual perception rather than social or structural realities. How to make those structural realities, how to make those social conditions better with the help of certain kinds of collective action or certain kinds of policy changes that may be thought of. So that's where the limitation of this particular theory lies. So that is social well-being for us, social well-being theory rather. We move on to another one, that is self-determination theory by Ryan and Dacey. So what does it tell us about? Well, it is an integrative model of motivational determinants of well-being. So this takes us towards the motivational determinants of well-being. How? Well, it says that, it posits that besides the nature of goals in our life, the basis of these goals, that is psychological needs like autonomy, competence, and relatedness, shapes one's sense of well-being. Let's take some example of how it may be possible. Well, before we take these examples, Ryan and Dacey also tells us about this important thing, this important consideration, that prevailing social or contextual conditions either facilitate or hinder well-being by supporting or not supporting autonomy, competence, and relatedness for our intrinsic as well as extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is something that tells us that, okay, if I do something, if I engage in something, that is highly fulfilling or satisfying for me. I don't need any kind of external rewards for that. But extrinsic motivation would mean that I'm working for not just self-fulfillment, but for certain kinds of external rewards. Let's see how this theory helps us understand the motivational determinants of well-being with the help of factors, contextual conditions that may facilitate or hinder these psychological needs towards intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. So let's take some example. The first one is that of intrinsic motivation, being supported by the conditions through the support towards a sense of autonomy or choice. So if I say that I engage in this course because I find the subject of psychology of well-being in itself being fulfilling. Well, we can see here that the circumstances, which is this, that there is a course called psychological well-being being offered by some instructor. So that's the context. And that helps me um, having a sense of choice that, okay, I choose this because it is fulfilling for me. So we see that the context is supporting my sense of autonomy through this intrinsic motivation that the course in itself is fulfilling for me. Well, how about the extrinsic motivation being supported besides the support towards autonomy? Well, let us see this particular example that I study well in this course as I have to get good grades for my career. We see here that I have a better sense of well-being because my extrinsic motivation is being facilitated by the conditions of having this particular course on psychology of well-being, while simultaneously that sense of autonomy that I have been able to exercise this choice that I am taking this course because this is going to help me get some reward in terms of grades as well as future career. So the conditions of having this particular course somewhere in some institutions like IIT Kanpur, India, is helping me having a better sense of well-being by actually facilitating my sense of autonomy for through the external motivation, through the extrinsic motivation of having a good sense of career through having good grades. We take the a different example now where the sense of autonomy is hindered. Okay, and it goes like this, that I have to do this course. Oh my goodness, I've got to do this course because humanities courses level 2 HSS2 course is compulsory at IIT Kanpur Institute, Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, India. So we see here that neither of these extrinsic or intrinsic motivation is being taken care of, number one, nor the sense of autonomy is taken care of. So this is where we find that the sense of autonomy can be actually catered to, and that may lead to an enhanced sense of well-being because the conditions may facilitate that supporting of autonomy towards intrinsic motivation we saw in example number one. The conditions could also facilitate well-being by supporting my sense of autonomy through extrinsic motivation that we saw in example number two. And then it could also be this, that it may not facilitate my sense of well-being by supporting autonomy at all. It may actually hinder my sense of well-being by not supporting my sense of autonomy because I'm doing something because of certain kinds of compulsion, that I feel to be there for me right now. So we find that this theory is a comprehensive enough theory in terms of helping us understand the motivational determinants of well-being. What are the limitations? Important one pointed out by the reviewers of well-being theories is that context taken only as constraints or facilitators of psychological needs, rather than these being taken in terms of social or structural realities. With that, we move on to another theory, that is PERMA model, PERMA model by Seligman, which is a recent one. And we'll begin with what is the P in this? P is positive emotions or feeling good. E is engagement or finding flow. Flow basically means that whether or not I'm getting immersed into present time through a positive activity, whether I have the opportunity for that. So those positive activities would be sports, art, artwork, or experiments, scientific experiments that I really enjoy and I find that I'm immersed into that. Then R would mean relationships, authentic connections. M would mean meaning or purposeful existence. And A would mean achievement or sense of accomplishment. Well, Seligman also posits that for well being, the following are critical. Beg your pardon. The first one is enduring traits, for example, altruism, creativity, etc., at the individual level, healthy relationships at the family and community level, and institutions at the organization and macro level, which means socioeconomic policies. So, well, we have already seen that there are enough uh, contributions in terms of how PERMA model helps us understand a sense of well-being. But the limitations is this, as it has been pointed out by various reviewers of well-being theories, is that the macro levels or these socioeconomic policies are usually ignored in theorizing and research on human well-being. Well, finally, we move on to the objective well-being, which is based on a systematic review of experts' opinion about objective conditions that would facilitate well-being. Well, the first one being physical well-being, um, which is comprised of health, safety, etc. Then material well-being, comprised of income, food, housing, transport, etc. in terms of material resources, social well-being or the relationship with persons and community, and development and activity, which is education, competence, productivity. Well, it also talks about emotional well-being, which is positive emotions, fulfillment, and self-esteem. Well, these have been taken to be important contributions in terms of helping us understand the advantaged or disadvantaged conditions people live their lives in. However, there's this limitation that it ignores the ways in which conditions and subjective experiences are related, particularly when the conditions are adverse. What are the struggles of well-being? So that is something which has not been explored in detail. Well, we have seen various theories in this particular lecture that pertain to the positivist or natural science paradigm because these theories locate the experience or perceptions of well-being in terms of the internal mechanisms or mechanisms within the person or the intrapsychic process, and it leaves aside various ways in which well-being could also be associated with certain social or structural realities of indifference, inequality, or injustice, which several sections of human population might also be experiencing. Thank you very much.